I get it. It's hard to believe. It's unbelievable. But can you believe it? Can you believe that? Especially when you look around, you notice the chaos and the uncertainty and the injustice, the bigotry and the pride, the malevolence, the animosity. Can you believe that God is paying attention? That there is a God of love who actually is involved in the affairs of men? I mean, even if you want to, even if you need to, even if you're desperate for that kind of hope, it's hard to believe. It's hard to believe. It's hard to believe when we look around in the world and we wonder, is God paying attention to what's going on? And we wonder, and we ask hard questions, and we get confused, and we struggle with doubt. And we find that our faith is restless. I want to suggest today that it's not a bad thing to have a restless faith. In fact, it's actually a good thing to have a restless faith. That there is nothing wrong with you if your faith is restless, if you're struggling with doubt, if you're asking hard questions, if you're confused by the chaos and the uncertainty of the world that we live in. If your faith is restless, there's nothing wrong with you. The question is, what does that mean? What does it mean to have a restless faith? And can we find contentment in a world that constantly produces in us a restless faith? Last week we began a conversation about restlessness and about contentment, and we began a conversation about the life of one of the most restless people who ever lived, the converted rabbi, Saul of Tarsus, Paul the Apostle. And we're journeying with him for a couple weeks to try and get a handle on finding contentment in a restless world, in a restless life. And today I want us to wrestle with a restless faith. What does that look like? What does it mean? Because I want to suggest that a restless faith is not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing. And that a restless faith is a faith worth having. And I want to share with you a story. I want to share with you a story that you may think you know, but you probably don't. It's the story of where and how Riverbend Church began. But before we talk about that and I tell you that story, would you pray with me for a moment? Father in heaven, I would ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart would be pleasing in your sight, that you would use your word spoken by your servant, anointed by your Spirit, to edify us and encourage us and challenge us and remind us to press into our doubt and our fear. Pray that that would be true of me and my family and all of us here. For I ask that in Jesus' name, amen. So the story begins at the end of February, 18 years after the resurrection of Christ in 51 AD. The Apostle Paul and his entourage were on what we call now his second missionary journey. They were venturing through a region called Macedonia in northeastern Greece, and they were in a town called Berea. It was there that the Apostle Paul left his companions behind and went by himself south on the Isthmus of Greece to the city of Athens. In the 17th chapter of Acts, it tells us the story of the Apostle Paul in the city of Athens, as far as we know, the first time he had ever been there. And it tells us in Acts chapter 17 that as Paul was waiting for his friends to arrive in Athens, he was distressed. Now, he might have been impressed. He probably was impressed because Athens was an impressive city 2,000 years ago. And for the 1,000 years before that, Athens, Greece, was sort of the philosophical center of Western civilization. It was Athens that the philosophers and the poets and the theorizers of all things metaphysical gathered in Athens. And it was there that the great temples to the Greek gods were constructed. As Paul walked through the streets of the city of Athens, he would have been walking down streets that had been inhabited by people, archaeologists estimate, for 3,000 years before Paul got there. People have lived in the city of Athens for 5,000 years. The history was written in the stone columns that had existed for hundreds of years, the better part of a millennium. The temples of Zeus and Hephaestus, and of course, on the mountain at the center of Athens was what was called the Acropolis. And there in the center of the Acropolis was the temple of Athena, or as we know it, the Parthenon. 75 years earlier, the Roman legion had sacked Athens and made it a vassal state of the Roman Empire. But the Roman emperors were so fascinated with Greek culture and Greek philosophy and Greek democracy that they considered themselves to be heirs of the legacy of Athens, and they began to restore the great temples. There were hundreds of them in the city of Athens. On the Acropolis alone, there were at least 20 other temples along with the Parthenon. And as the Apostle Paul made his way through the streets of Athens, that part of him that was originated in the Ten Commandments, that you shall not make a graven image or an idol, must have burned within Paul. And he was distressed as he saw the pantheism and the idolatry of the city laid out before him. And so Paul did what he always did. He found a synagogue. Because as Paul traveled through the Roman Empire, he found the diaspora Jews and found their places of worship. And he would go in, and he was a card-carrying rabbi, a Pharisee of Pharisees. And he would go in and he'd say, I'd like to find out how you guys are doing. I'd like to find out how your faith is. And they never saw him coming, because he would then show up and explain to them the story of Jesus of Nazareth. And many churches were birthed out of those conversations in the synagogue. But when Paul was in Athens, he couldn't stay in the synagogues. He went out into the agora, into the marketplace. And he not only talked to the Jews, he talked to the God-fearing Greeks. And he told them the story of Jesus of Nazareth. And he proclaimed the good news of second chances, of forgiveness, the story of the resurrection. After some amount of time, perhaps just a few days, he caught the ear of the leading philosophers in Athens. There were two groups of philosophers in the city of Athens at that time, kind of like two political groups, like Republicans and Democrats. They were the Epicureans and the Stoics. The Epicureans had a history that went back 3 centuries to the philosopher Epicurus. And the Epicureans were materialists. We often confuse the Epicureans and the hedonists. But the Epicureans believed in sort of a pleasure principle that was a measured pleasure. It was a form of not kinetic pleasure, which is pleasure that's derived simply from intaking. It was a katastematic pleasure, a pleasure that came from avoiding pain. The highest goal for an Epicurean was to be free from anxiety, to be free from worry, to be free from pain. They loved the better things in life, but they realized that too much of a good thing would actually create complications. So the Epicureans were very measured in their materialism. On the other side of the aisle were the Stoics, and the Stoics were more metaphysical. They were more mysterious. And they believed that the goal of man was to control your emotions, to bring your emotions in line with nature. That the moral well-being of a person was not the Epicurean state of atarxis or the state of peace of mind. It was really to be in harmony with nature. If nature was encouraging anger, you should be angry. If it was encouraging joy, you should be joyful. But a person should align themselves stoically with the appropriate emotions of their environment. And Paul began a debate with them, and they were confused by what Paul is saying. What is this babbler trying to say? It sounds like he's introducing foreign gods, and we thought we had all the gods covered. And he's introducing another one. But really what Paul was doing is he was telling them the story of Jesus. And he was telling them the story of the resurrection and the hope of second chances, of rising from the ashes, of conquering death. And he was so convincing that the leaders of the Epicureans and the Stoics said, we got to put you on YouTube, man. We got to get your word out there. Well, they didn't have YouTube 2,000 years ago, but they had a place called the Areopagus. For 500 years in Athens, Greece, the debate about philosophy and ideology and how the world worked was carried out in a formal setting. It was like a public courtroom. It was called the Areopagus. The Romans renamed it Mars Hill. And it was a public courtroom, and there were actually judges. Think of them like professors. And you would go, and every day the Athenians would gather in the Areopagus, and Luke, who wrote the book of Acts, points out that the people who lived in Athens and even the foreigners who moved there just loved nothing better than doing nothing, but sitting around and hearing the latest ideas. And all of this took place in the Areopagus, where these ideas were debated and judgment was passed on what was intelligent and what was not, what was a better argument or a better philosophy. It's why Athens was sort of the center of Western civilization, because of what took place there on Mars Hill in the Areopagus. And that's where Paul went. And they said, we want to know what you're talking about. Our ears are being tickled. You're saying things that we had never heard. Tell us. And they gave Paul the floor of the Areopagus. And there, probably in the first week of March of 51 AD, the Apostle Paul stood up in the center of the developing Western civilization. And he said, people of Athens, I can tell you are a very religious bunch. I have walked around your city. I have looked at your temples. I have seen your statues. I have watched your behavior. In fact, as I was searching through your city, I even found a temple dedicated to the worship of the Agathos Theos, the unknown God. Agnostos, sorry. The unknown God. And I'm here today, Paul said, in front of the people gathered in the Areopagus. I'm here today to tell you that you're worshiping in ignorance. And I'm here to tell you about the unknown God. Paul goes on to say that the Lord of the universe, the creator of heaven and earth, made everything. And that God is the God that you call the Agnothos Theos, the unknown God. And this God doesn't dwell in temples made by hands. In fact, he doesn't even need hands. He made your hands. He made the hands that made the temples of the gods that you worship. He doesn't need your help. He doesn't need my help. What Paul is doing is Paul is technically making a cosmological argument. In an argument for the existence of God, the cosmological argument basically says God must necessarily exist. Why must God necessarily exist? Because in a hierarchy of gods, there has to be a God above all other gods. You can't have a hierarchy and have a group of gods. You have to have a God that was the uncaused first cause. A God who made the other gods. A God who made everything else. You had to have the thing that started everything. And Paul said, that's the one I'm talking about. That's your unknown God. He goes on to describe to them that this God who doesn't dwell in temples made by hands, the one who made the world and everything in it, is also the one who made us. And he gave us life and breath. And he made the nations, and he set out the course of human history, and he divided the boundaries of the lands. And everything that we are experiencing, that God is aware of. And God did all of this. We exist. The world exists. The universe exists so that we might seek him. And so that we might reach out to him and perhaps find him. And Paul says to the people gathered there in the Areopagus, he says, you're closer than you even know. Because that God is not far from you. You are not far from the kingdom of that God. See, Paul could have condemned them. Paul could have, and I'm sure that inside of him, the idolatry and the polytheism of the Greek people enraged him. He was trained that you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not fashion graven images, and that's all he saw. But he doesn't condemn them. He doesn't wag his finger and say, you people are all lost, you're idiots. You're morons. You're worshiping the creation instead of the creator of the creation. How can you be so ignorant? Paul doesn't do that. Paul says, you're looking for the right thing. God did all of this so that you will seek him. You see, the argument can be made that restlessness, that unsettledness, that questioning, that search for answers, that search for the reason behind all the other reasons, for the uncaused first cause, that quest that we are all on, that every human being is on. It doesn't matter whether you cut through the pages of history, no matter the civilization, no matter the historical time frame. Human beings have always been restless and always needed to try to find their way home. It's as if we are orphan children searching for our birth parents. And Paul is saying that restlessness is leading you toward the true God. That restlessness was in fact put there by God. He then goes on to quote off the top of his head somehow two great Greek philosopher poets. The first one is a semi-mythical figure named Epimenides. Epimenides, the historians aren't sure whether he was actually a historical figure or whether it was just his story became so embellished that he really was fictional, he was legendary. But the story of Epimenides goes back to 600 BC. There was a plague that was ravaging the city-state of Athens. And the Athenian people, as was their custom 2,600 years ago, when tragedy struck, they would make offerings to their gods to abate the tragedies. But the plague didn't stop, and they had made all the offerings that the priests of these gods had told them to make. And then Epimenides stood up and said, we've forgotten one God. We've forgotten the Agnos Theos. We've forgotten the unknown God. We've forgotten the God above all other gods. We've forgotten to honor and to worship and make sacrifices to the God above all the other gods, the unknown God. Because we have our life in him. He is the one in whom we live and move and have our being. And this is a quote from the story of Epimenides and the sacrifice to the unknown God that ended the plague in Athens. And Paul says, they were looking for the right one. He then quotes a scientist, philosopher, poet named Aratus. Aratus lived 250 years before Paul, and he had been an advisor to the Macedonian kings, and he wrote songs about their rule and their military victory. And one of his most famous songs, you could say one of his greatest hits, was a song of how we are the children of God. We are the offspring of God. And Paul says Aratus was looking for the same thing you and I are looking for. We're looking for the God above all other gods. And that restlessness that you feel was put there by God. We are orphans looking for our parents. He then goes on to say, if we in fact are his offspring, if we are these children of God, if we are orphans of God, then why would we worship the creation instead of the creator? Why would we worship the manufactured gods that are carved out of gold and silver and stone? Why would we do that if we are in fact children of God? And then in verses 30 and 31 of Acts chapter 17, the Apostle Paul gets very serious. He says, up till now, up till this time, God has overlooked our ignorance. God understands that we couldn't see into the future, that human beings could not see around the corner of history, and they cannot know what we now know. That God will judge the world, and he has appointed one man to be that judge. We read verses 30 and 31, and there's words like repentance and judgment, and we get all uncomfortable with the religiosity of those words. But the argument that Paul was making was that if our lives matter, we have to be accountable. If our lives are going to matter, then we have a responsibility. And how do we know if we have fulfilled that responsibility? And Paul says, there is one who is righteous, who knows you and knows me better than we know ourselves. That this is the one who calls us to begin again, who calls us to start our lives afresh, who offers us mercy and grace and second chances. There is this one. And how do we know that this one is the one who represents the one true God, the unknown God? Because God raised him from the dead. See, the Apostle Paul is telling the story of the hero's journey, a story that they were all familiar with, the story of the one who rises from the ashes, the story of the one who triumphs over his enemies against all certain defeat. But really, it's a story of second chances and mercy and forgiveness. It's a story of new beginnings. It was a story they had never heard before. And in that place, it tells us in the Areopagus that they were divided. There were some who sneered at him and said, oh, this guy has lost his mind. He's telling us fanciful stories of God among us and God who resurrected from the dead and second chances and mercy and grace and love and forgiveness. These are fanciful stories, but there were others who said, tell us more. This is very interesting. The story ends with the birth of the church in Athens. It tells us about two people. It tells us about Dionysius, the Areopagite, one of the judges from the Areopagus named Dionysius. If you go to Athens today, in the shadow of the Parthenon, there is a church called the Church of Saint Dionysius, the Areopagite. His birth is celebrated as a religious holiday in both the Eastern Orthodox and the Catholic churches. He is the patron saint of Athens. And it tells us about a woman named Damaris and doesn't mention the others, but there in the conversation on Mars Hill, there in the Areopagus, in the spring of 51 AD, the church was born in Athens. And I would suggest to you that Riverbend was born there. That we are just continuing the conversation. That it is our mission to enter into the agora, into the marketplace, to have the conversation that involves the hard questions, the wondering and the doubt and the fear and the uncertainty. That it is our mission. That what was born in that conversation in Athens, Greece, 2,000 years ago was the DNA of this place. That Riverbend was born there, and that we are inheritors of the conversation that began on Mars Hill. We are here in the city of Austin to say to our family and friends that restlessness that you feel was put there by a loving God who wants you to find your way home. Not to condemn that curiosity, not to eliminate the doubt or the fear, but to press into it. To embrace that restlessness. Because you see, that's what contentment is. Contentment is not the absence of struggle, it's the presence of strength. And your faith is stronger than you know. And the resources that are available to you are beyond your comprehension. And we are called to continue the conversation that began on the Areopagus in Athens, Greece, 2,000 years ago. It is our mission. Can you believe that? I know it's hard to believe. I know it is. It's hard for us to believe, to look at the chaos of the world around us, to look at the injustice and the unfairness and the unrighteousness, to look at the triumph of evil and the malice, and to look at the struggle of the world that we live in and believe that God's got this. I get it. I get it. I'm just as restless as the rest of us. But there's nothing to be ashamed of. I think it is something to be embraced, something to be understood. Because I think we all know someone who has abandoned their faith of their youth, who has walked away from their confidence in God because the struggle wore them out, because the pain and the tragedy and the disasters of life just created a weight that they could not escape from under. We all know what that is, but I would suggest to you that a restless faith is better than no faith at all. And that it's okay to struggle and to question and to press in, and that restlessness was put there by God, that we might seek him and find him, that we would ask and he would answer, that we would seek and we would find, and that we would knock and it would be open to us. This is the story, not just of how the church was born in Athens, but how Riverbend was born. And I know it's hard to believe. It's hard to believe in the world that we live in. It was hard to believe 2,000 years ago. But the restlessness of our faith is the evidence that we're moving the right way. And our faith is stronger than we know. And our resources are deeper than we can imagine. Can you believe that?